Hello, this is Mr. Smith, and this is the last of the Econ 2 lectures. This is about macroeconomic policy around the world. And so in this, we'll talk about the diversity of countries and economics across the world, because obviously each country is different geographically, culturally, and they're not going to be able to have the same type of macroeconomic policy. Of course, one of the goals of every country, even if you're in favor of more or less government involvement, is to improve the country's standard of living. Unemployment is also different in each country, and we'll be taking a look at why joblessness is not the same everywhere. And then, of course, inflation. Inflation has some of the same root causes, but obviously, as different countries have different policies on money, for instance, that can also alter how inflation carries out. And balance of trade concerns. Each country, of course, wants to be able to sell the most from their own country and buy as little as possible from others. That used to be an official policy to enforce that through tariffs and other types of economic barriers known as mercantilism, but that faded into the past. So now countries are trying to keep a balance between opening up trade, realistically knowing that they're going to have to end up buying from other countries if they're going to be selling, and making sure that the hardship that goes along with that is minimized at the least. So looking for work, of course, is a problem in every country, and it has been throughout time. The emptying out of agricultural areas into urban, for instance, during the Industrial Revolution in the United States, that caused the Gilded Era when there was lots of corruption and lack of infrastructure and services in cities, and a cry out for the progressive reforms that happened in the next era, were all because of the shift of people basically looking for work. The Grapes of Wrath is a book famously about the Great Depression, about a family that moves from the Midwest that suffered because of dust storms during the economic contraction, going out to California to find work. So this isn't a new problem. It's been going on for quite some time, and we often have, even in good economic times, ways of trying to attract people or find them the right places of employment, like job fairs, for instance, is what's pictured here. And so unemployment does occur. It does have different causes in different countries over time, and they need different types of solutions to solve it. And of course, one of the things that every country needs to look at, besides the actual gross domestic product, is the standard of living. And the question is the standard of living, in other words, the type of life that people are able to afford in your country on average, is that good enough? Is that enough? Because we need to be concerned about each other as human beings. We need to make sure that our fellow human beings are working and productive, and if their standard of living is low, if they're distracted from their efforts at all, that can be bad for all of us. And on top of that, you can look at it as a sign of strength for the country, because we can promote a country that has a high standard of living. And so one of the ways you can come up with a standard of living is to take the GDP, the gross domestic product, and divide it into the number of people, which is known as GDP per capita. Per capita means per head in Latin. So a low-income country is that where there's less than $1,025 per year per person. Middle-income country goes from there to $12,475, and high income is considered over 12. Now notice, in the United States, for a single person in the year 2020, $12,475 is just about the poverty line. That is not the same in other countries. There are some countries where they can maybe only make $6,000 a year, and they're not doing that badly because of the low cost of living. So that also has to be taken into consideration. But per capita GDP gives us a brief kind of snapshot of it, but it doesn't offer the entire picture. So other things can look at that, for instance, life expectancy, the overall health of the people, the amount of students or people of student age that are enrolled in school, the amount that complete school, the amount that are literate, the amount of human rights, civil rights, and liberties that take place within a country, the amount of crime statistics that happen per 100,000, the infant mortality rate. All of these things can show us a better picture of exactly how well a country is doing and what the standard of living is like. So other factors can obviously go into that, as I just mentioned, and hopefully we're looking at those things in order to take into consideration whether or not the GDP or the GDP per capita is actually reflective of a good standard of living. This is the percent of global GDP and percent of population. So high-income countries that make up that above 12,475 fall into this group here. And this is the percent of global GDP. So those richer countries, we'll call them, the high countries, they make up over 2/3 of the world's gross domestic product. Those in the middle income range, which are between 1,025 and 12,475, are in this bluish color. They make up about 31.7%, so less than a third. And this tiny sliver of low income, which is less than this 1,025, they make up this little sliver of the gross domestic product. But if we look at their share of the population, we can see that they make up 11.8% of the population of the world. High income makes up 18.8%. Most people fall in this middle income range with almost 70%. And there we can see the different types of countries and where they fall in this category. The United States falls into the top range of 34,000 to 110,000. So there you can see the United States, Canada, Western Europe, Italy, the Scandinavian countries, Australia, and then Japan. We can see that the next range up isn't too bad, 12,800 to 33, and that would include some Eastern European countries, Saudi Arabia, for instance, New Zealand, Spain, so the Iberian Peninsula, including Portugal, some South American countries in the north. So there are a little bit more sprinkling of diversity geographically when it comes to that next highest level. There we can see the bottom one, mostly concentrated in the southern hemisphere, South Asia, Africa, and these other groups that are also oranges or red, you can see they mostly take place in the southern divide. So if we can have a slanted equator, then we could see that most of them fall underneath that range. So there's a clear imbalance in the gross domestic product across the world with, like I said before, the United States, Canada, and to a lesser extent Mexico, Australia, Western Europe have the highest GDPs. Supply, demand, interactions in the marketplace, creation of prices, allocation of resources, things go where they're supposed to because of the invisible hand. That's all neoclassical determinants. But there's also other reasons: geographic, demographic, young versus old, industry, agriculture versus urbanization, and economic institutions. In particularly Africa, there is a huge amount of younger people, for instance. Geography. Many of these countries, despite a system of rivers and a tiny bit of railroads, really not that much infrastructure, many of these countries are landlocked. These countries are landlocked. So that often has a type of impact on the economic status of a country. Industry structure, when they're agricultural based, and below this line, of course, we do have a lot of agriculturally based economies and economic institutions. Old economic institutions and governments can oftentimes lend themselves to stability, which helps promote economic growth. So growth consensus. Basically what it boils down to is an overall view that physical capital has a big determinant in the income differentiation that happens. The availability of tools, of manufacturing base, those kinds of things, that all has a big role to play when it comes to economic determination. The East Asian tigers, as they're called, which include Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong, South Korea, have high growth rates, lots of export, so they're selling a lot of products, and they're industrializing quickly between 1960 and 1990s, which has led them to be technological leaders. So if we look back on the map here, South Korea, as you can see, is one of those countries, so is Taiwan, and those East Asian tigers, as they're called, went from being at the same place as some of these orangish countries to being in the top tier here, at the second to top tier, within a relatively short period of time of just 3 decades. So how do we get the economy to grow, and how difficult is it? Making sure that you have an educated workforce. So K through 12 is not just important, but then afterwards seeing where they go into the workforce based on trade or college education, and making sure that new technologies are being researched and developed, and then people are being shown how to use them. Most of the goals of public policy is to shift the aggregate supply curves to the right. That is the total supply of all products. And so whenever you increase the availability of products that is going to decrease prices, which allows people to afford more, and therefore they should be able to have a higher standard of living. Fiscal policy, which would be what the legislatures complete, they want to focus on investing in education, which is human capital, technology, physical plants and equipment, so large purchases, or research and development. Monetary policy is that in which the central banks get to complete. They want to try to keep inflation low and stable to make sure that companies and businesses and government can make good predictions about the future, that people know what's going on so they can save and invest properly, not be scared about what to do with their money. And that also helps out when it comes to trade and international competition. Japan's prime minister used fiscal and monetary policies to stimulate his country's economy, which has only worked in the short run. In the second decade of the 2000s, many high-income countries found themselves more focused on short-term. But developed countries need to have both a short-run and long-term focus. One of the biggest challenges, of course, would be government intervention. We often think of, well, that's when more, using American terms, a liberal political party, for instance, wants to institute more programs and taxes to pay for them. But that's not the only thing. It can be even more conservative-leaning parties, especially if they have a populist tinge, or they want to block foreign trade, or have some other types of protections in place to make it look like we're as productive as the past, when they don't realize, of course, that over time things change, and so does your economy. And so these types of barriers, which are political in nature, can put up regulatory walls to stop from making sure that you have the best standard of living possible. Heavy regulation of banking and financial sector has happened because of mistakes made in the past, like the financial crisis in 2008. And it stops banks from overspending, overloaning, and putting their money in dangerous situations, which can, of course, endanger all our money since we save our money in banks. The question is this stopping them from investing too much, that they're not encouraging growth, especially in new technologies, or is it preventing a big bubble from being created that will eventually burst? The 10 lowest income countries, here you can see Democratic Republic of Congo, only about $400 US per year in 2013, and there's Afghanistan at the top. So this shows you, and Africa, we have a lot of African countries, and then followed by some, of course, technically in the ocean, and then Afghanistan, which is in the Middle East, roughly. Growth policies for economically challenged countries. These types of countries often lack any type of government reliability, possible corruption or inefficiency. They don't have institutions that back market-based solutions, encouraging competition. And so there isn't that climate of growth, and so then foreigners don't want to take money and invest in return. So macroeconomic policies for low-income economies are vastly different from those from high-income economies. Those low-income economies, they're very suspicious of foreign investors. They don't trust their governments because they haven't been competent or lacking in corruption for such a long time. And so you don't see a lot of collaboration that happens, and you don't see a lot of faith put into either their domestic or foreign institutions. And so instability and a lack of faith kind of dooms the macroeconomic policy from working too well that's traditionally used in low-income countries. And they have little to work with. And when you have very little put into human capital, and so your public education system has very few resources, you really do have to rely on the independence of people. And that works for some, but obviously not for all, especially if you have a lack of jobs, if there's disease that is prevalent in your country, if there's a lack of food, so malnutrition happens, and people aren't going to care too much about starting their own business if they're starving. Low-income countries are at a disadvantage because any incomes that people receive are spent immediately on necessities such as food. So food, shelter, clothing, those kinds of things, medicine. Foreign aid and external investment contributes to these economies, but are not sufficient to allow for capital accumulation because, once again, it will go to those, or if it's corrupt government, it will go anywhere. And then in turn, there isn't enough money, or there was never a total amount of money necessary in order to invest in physical and human capital. for cyclical unemployment caused by the economy when there's a recession. So, in other words, when a contraction happens and pessimism and the forecast of decreased productivity causes companies really to lay off, making a self fulfilling prophecy. When that type of cyclical unemployment happens, there are tools available to confront that, but usually only in high income countries. So European economies have a high natural rate of unemployment because they have a greater number of rules and restrictions that discourage firms from hiring and unemployed workers from taking jobs. And that's one of the criticisms of the safety net policies that exist within Western Europe in particular. So low-income countries have large pools of people, huge pools of people that are involved in harvesting of natural resources or working the land or fishing and hunting. A large part of their economic activity happens with bartering and trading. So it's not as simple as, oh, look, this person hasn't gotten a regular paycheck in the last month, but they've been looking for a new job by going to the unemployment office. That type of system doesn't exist. So it's more difficult to keep track of things like unemployment. However, you do have, especially if a large portion of the people are concentrated on natural resources, agriculture or mining or logging or whatever, then they're also going to be more nomadic, traveling throughout the country to wherever work is supposed to be. So it's also hard to track people that way, and you can't provide the same type of unemployment assistance if that's the situation as well. High-income economies can use monetary policy to prevent inflation. So they can use tools with their centralized bank by raising and lowering interest rates, by buying and selling of bonds in order to help control the supply of money. In a number of middle and lower income economies around the world, though, that's kind of a problem. These countries tend to have large amounts of deficit spending because they don't have enough tax revenue to maybe take care of all of the policies they've enacted. This often results in governments printing too much money, which is a cause of quantity theory leading to higher inflation rates. And that can become dangerous if it spins out of control and causes hyperinflation, which can destroy the economy and the monetary system. Sometimes when inflation is going up considerably, these middle and low income countries can take care of that by indexing things like wages to inflation. So if your inflation rate is 10%, then wages have to also go up by 10%. Of course, one of the most effective things in helping an overall economy from a macro sense is to reduce trade barriers, to get rid of export restraints, import quotas, and then trade barriers like tariffs, which are usually the most common, taxes on imports. Those types of measures can help boost overall standard of living. It makes businesses more competitive. It makes businesses better at allocating resources. It introduces cheaper goods and services to the country and overall increases the standard of living. So not participating in world trade can be a problem. But of course, there are always concerns about that, particularly from destroying domestic, especially infant industries, those that are newer, endangering local workers, and then also facing domination, possibly corruption from international corporations. And of course, protecting the infant industry has worked in the past for some countries, which is subsidizing, in particular, new industries or putting tariffs on the products that they might have to compete with from imports. However, subsidizing is probably the best method possible, and that has to be weaned off of them over time. In the past, we've seen high-income countries that end up exporting more than they import, which creates a trade surplus. A trade surplus, on the other hand, low and middle income countries will receive trade deficits. However, we've actually seen some different things happen because of that. So the U.S. economy, because it's so big and complex, it has actually resulted in a trade deficit at times, although it is relatively small and we're still the world's second largest exporter. And then other countries have experienced large capital inflows that they might not have seen before. So lots of foreign investment. But of course, that situation causes problems. There might be foreign investment, but it might be triggered next to things like increasing taxes or allowing for curtailment of large public programs. And so whenever they do get investments like this, there might be some type of austerity measures that encourages the government to draw back its efforts. And then, of course, that leads to layoffs of government employees. It leads to curtailing of those programs that might benefit certain groups of people, especially in the middle and lower class. And that can lead to protests, like what happened in Greece. But human capital development, of course, is important. And as we move forward with new and more innovative forms of technology, like solar power, for instance, it's going to take some investment in order to make sure that happens. Many countries that are south of that line that I showed you earlier are in places where they can have the benefit of more solar energy in particular, but that's going to take investment and confidence for foreign companies to actually go there and do that. So these are just some of the macroeconomic problems and how they arise and looked at differently and addressed in other parts of the world.